So, hello, Susan. Thank you so much to doing this short interview conversation about forest and carbon. And Susan Trumbore is one of the world's experts on carbon ecology, carbon 14, and more. And is the director of Max Planck biogeochemistry and a professor at UCI. So, Susan, why do you study carbon in forests?
Okay, first, thanks, Paolo, for the conversation, and greetings from Germany in my office where I am. So I study carbon in forests because I really care about the global carbon cycle, and in particular where the carbon dioxide we put in the atmosphere, where it ends up. And one of the big mysteries that's been around for a long time is we can't balance the budget. We know how much we put in the atmosphere, but and we know more or less how much is dissolving the oceans, and then we just say the rest is going into the biosphere. And forests have a lot of carbon. We think they may be storing more or less because of carbon dioxide or warming or disturbances, and so it's always been the big mystery in the global carbon budget. And so that's one of the reasons I started as an oceanographer, and I ended up studying forests and soils and carbon because that was the biggest unknown.
Cool. So are forests carbon hungry?
When they're growing, they are, yes. So, I mean, when we know when a forest is disturbed, if it burns down. So I did some work in boreal forests, and there, the forests tend to burn every 100 years, and then they accumulate carbon until they burn again. But if you look at any given forest, if it's growing, it's taking up carbon. But then if you step back and say, well, there's a 1% chance that this forest will burn, and it takes about 100 years to reaccumulate the carbon. Then if you look at the landscape scale and you say 1% of the land burns every year, then you have a landscape that's in carbon balance, even though 99% of it is accumulating carbon, the 1% lost so much that it balances the rest. So that's the big trick, is a lot of people will tell you, oh, forests are absorbing carbon, because we tend to study the ones that are absorbing carbon. And so you really have to go, you need this atmospheric concentration of CO2 to tell you if you're fooling yourself or not.
Okay, cool.
as a balance or a measure, yeah.
So, and usually you have studied forests more in the high latitude systems, but also in the tropics. And what are some of the big differences in terms of carbon of these two systems?
So the biggest difference is how much carbon is in the trees versus how much is in the soils. So, you know, in the tropics, you tend to have these massive trees that store huge amounts of carbon mixed in with the little tiny ones that are growing in the understory. But when you go to really high latitude boreal forests, you know, you get close to the tree line, the trees are tiny and they contain almost no carbon, but the soils have huge amounts. So, you know, when it gets cold, decomposition is slower, and especially the litter layers that accumulate on the forest floor, they're almost nothing in the tropics because everything disappears, you know, within a few months, as you know. But when you go into high latitudes, you can get these thick accumulations of carbon and mosses and things that, you know, they'll burn easily, or if it warms up and dries out, they'll decompose really fast. So that's the big difference. So in the boreal forest, we were mostly studying the soils, whereas in tropical forests, we mostly study the trees.
So I'm assuming then that there are different vulnerabilities of these two different types of forests to global changes, right?
Right. So the big concern in the high latitudes is going to be the warming that's going on. And it's, you know, we have amplified warming in the high latitudes. So there's a lot of concern about melting permafrost and all the carbon that's stored there, and also changes in the frequency of these big fires that are natural in boreal forests as disturbance elements. But then what we worry about more in tropical forests is human disturbances like logging or clear cutting, but also the balance of natural disturbances that take away the big stores of carbon that are in the tree trunks and then put them on the forest floor where they can decompose rapidly. And then the question becomes, how long does it take to put that carbon back? Will you get, you might get a lot of the biomass back in 25 years, but it might take hundreds of years to grow back the sort of biodiversity and the distribution of biomass in the different kinds of trees.
Cool. So Susan, what are some of the techniques you use to study all these dynamics? How much carbon there is, how much carbon is cycled through the systems?
So I said I was an oceanographer, and oceanographers use tracers. And so my main tool is the radioisotope carbon-14. And it's useful in two ways on two kinds of timescales. So everybody probably has heard of carbon-14 dating, where you can use, there's a certain amount of carbon-14 that's created in the atmosphere, and then plants take that up, and it ends up going through the plants and into the soils. And once the plants stop taking carbon out of the atmosphere, they've got a fixed amount of C14, and then it decays radioactively over time with a half-life of about 5,700 years. So for things that are hundreds to thousands of years old, for example, I can go and look at a peat bog in, the northern latitudes and measure how much radiocarbon there is at different depths and figure out, oh, this has been accumulating carbon for 7,000 years at a very slow rate. Or, we can go to trees in the Amazon and go to a place where a logger was, get something from the center of the tree and say, oh, this tree was, 500 years old when it was cut down. But the other way we can use carbon-14 is on these short time scales. So we had nuclear weapons testing in the atmosphere that created a lot of carbon-14. And we watch where that excess goes over time. And that means that the atmosphere has had different amounts of carbon-14 over time since the 1960s. And people have measured it, so we know exactly how much it declined every year. So we can measure in a tree, for example, if you have rings, you can look at every year and say, here's what the carbon-14 did. And that's what got locked into the tree. And then, for trees that don't necessarily have rings, we can, use that to talk about the growth rate or the age of the tree, or the tree bark, which is something Paulo does. We can look at in forest soil, at the very top part to say, okay, here's how fast the moss is growing, things like this. So we have a tool that's useful either on these sort of 100-year timescales or looking at things in the last few years to decades. And that's what I do.
Yeah, for me, it was super interesting one time. Yeah. It was very interesting one time I collaborated. I was an undergrad, I think. And then I had some leaves that I knew that they were 1 year old. And then you look at them and said, oh, let me get this carbon-14 out of these leaves. And actually the carbon was much older than 1 year old because plants had reserves and they were just using those old reserves to build that leaf. And for me, it was mind blowing to think that you could measure that with C14 and then get this missing carbon within the tree and pointed out that it's been used to build leaves.
Yeah. So we actually published a paper since then on the using the radiocarbon content of maple syrup. So we got people to tap the maple trees, and give us some of the maple syrup, and then we measured the radiocarbon and the sugars that were being used to regrow the leaves of the maple tree, and it was between 3 and 5 years old. So it's the same idea that, even though we watch the leaf grow, its first part is growing from these storage reserves that were fixed, 3 to 5 years ago, and they're a mixed reserve inside the tree. And then the youngest part so the oldest part of the leaf is carbon-14 that's 3 to 5 years old, and then the youngest part is what the leaf fixed itself. So we can look at the age gradient in a leaf as it kind of unfolds and grows. So that's pretty cool.
Awesome. So, and then you also are is one of the directors or coordinators of this ATO project. Can you tell us a little bit about that also?
So ATO stands for the Amazon Tall Tower Observatory, and it's a 325-meter tall tower in the middle of the Amazon, so northeast of Manaus, in the sort of the intact forest in the central Amazon. And we also have two, I guess you've talked about these eddy covariance towers. We have two smaller towers that are more close to the forest canopy. So they're only 80 meters tall as opposed to 325. And those are more for understanding the interactions of the atmosphere with the canopy itself. So we look at volatile organic compounds, the things that have smells that the trees are making for all kinds of purposes, communication, attracting pollinators, getting rid of excess heat, whatever that is. And then looking at how those mix into the atmosphere, go higher. We're looking at the carbon balance of the forest directly with the eddy covariance method. And we're also looking at the energy balance and how it all interacts with clouds and rainfall. So the tall tower lets us get far out of the influence of the local forest. And so it allows us to integrate over a much larger region what the net effect of the forest on the atmosphere is. And so the idea is to start a 20-year experiment, which actually the tower started running now, basically. We're a little delayed because of coronavirus from getting the last instruments on the tower, but the idea is to run it for 20 years and watch, through years that might have major droughts, years that might, have major wet seasons. And we know that, there'll be this long-term warming that's going on in the background, and to try to understand how all that climate change is going to impact both the forest, but also how it's functioning, how it's interacting with the atmosphere, and what the net result of that is regionally. So.
Okay, cool. So
it's an
Susan,
exciting project.
We have over 40 students in the class, and they are from all sorts of backgrounds, all the way from chemistry to environmental science to earth system science. And many of them are super interested in sustainability and in this world of global change. Do you have any overall advice for these students or tip?
You can never learn enough mathematics. I'm sorry. That's not a joke, but it's my personal mantra. I think the main thing to know is that you have to tackle these really large problems of environmental change. You can't just know one thing. Like, being a chemist isn't enough, because let's say you care about this compound that a leaf is making and you want to know the synthesis of that compound. But what's really important about that compound is that it goes into the atmosphere, and maybe biologically it's got some interaction with a moth or a caterpillar that it's using for either defense or to attract something. And even more important, maybe it's the rate at which it mixes into the atmosphere that determines how far its signal goes and what its impact can be. So you can't just know the synthesis of the compound. You also have to understand metabolically how that might change if carbon dioxide levels change. And so to really get the whole picture, you have to think about aspects that you're maybe not trained in. And that's why Earth System Science to me is so exciting, because we try to combine all these things. Maybe we're an expert in one of them, but we need all those other pieces to put the whole puzzle together and understand the impact of what we're studying.
That's really, really good. Okay, Susan, there is one last question. It's a kind of tough one. And it's just about how do you see the future of forests in the systems we're studying?
Oh, the future of forests. I think that's a really, I mean, it'll be what we want it to be, right? So if we're smart, we'll have a lot of set aside forests that hopefully are resilient to climate change and they'll stay there. I mean, I think change is inevitable, and you know, we're starting to work a lot more in China now, where you know they have all these planted forests that they planted specifically to take up carbon, and in the you know a couple decades ago, right after the climate negotiations started. And you know, one of the questions they're asking is, well, is the functioning of these forests sufficient compared to the natural forests that, you know, it's been a long time since China had natural forests. So they're trying to build something that can be a forest, and they're asking a lot of these same questions, like what is it? If we can't have a pristine forest, is it okay to have a real forest? And you know, here in Germany, we also, you know, I look out the window and I see forests, but they're all 40 years old. They're managed. You know, a lot of the trees are dying because of the droughts that we've had for the last 2 summers here. And it could be that the trees are just aging out and they're getting, you know, they're vulnerable, and so they're dying because they're really vulnerable to drought, and they're all the same age cohort. So that's the kind of stuff that people in my department are doing research into now, you know, why these specific trees are dying and not those ones, and what can the foresters here do to prevent large-scale forest decline and mortality.
Okay, cool.
That's a long answer to a
so
short
there,
question.
yes, definitely.
But I think it goes with
Okay,
your theme of what is a forest, you know, and how do we define a forest? You know, is it just a collection of trees, or is it something more? So.
Yeah, no, and then we were developing this, the first module is just more the ecology of these systems and how they interact with the environment, and then how we're changing these natural systems, and then what are some of the opportunities to change their future towards more sustainable pathway, hopefully.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Susan, and
Okay.
hope that you enjoyed, and I'm sure the students will have a blast.
Okay.